In our never-ending quest to learn how to think like a leader today, we want to look at Mordecai in the book of Esther. Mordecai was a despised ethnic and religious minority living in a hostile environment. So he was a Jew in Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and the attitude toward Jewish people hasn't changed a whole lot in the thousands of years since. So how do you lead in an unjust, unwelcoming, volatile, violent situation when everything is on the line with almost every leadership move you make? And what we find with Mordecai is not only was he a despised minority, he had no leadership position. He had no leadership authority. He had no leadership power. He had no leadership contacts and no strings to pull. And yet he led. And we see from the beginning of Esther to the end, we see his leadership presence. And what we find is it was almost exclusively relational leadership. And I think there's something about leading without a title, without position, without authority, without all of the backings of leadership. And if we find ourselves in those situations, then there's a lot to learn from Mordecai, specifically about relational leadership. So I want to look at 4 lessons if we want to think like a leader, to think like Mordecai. Here we go. Number 1, he set up the next generation for success. And I can't think of anything more leadership-like than that, to set up the next generation. That's what leaders do. The job of a leader is not just to accomplish things, but there's always a multi-generational aspect to biblical leadership, to wise leadership, to smart leadership. So if we want to think like a leader, think like Mordecai. Think about the next generation and how we can use whatever relational and leadership influence we have to set them up for success. And so what we find in chapter 2, verse 10, Esther is his adopted daughter. She is the daughter of Mordecai's uncle, and she grew up, the scripture tells us, with no mother and father. Right? So we assume she's an orphan. And he not only adopted her and raised her, we're told, but he starts mentoring her. And sometimes leads, sometimes encourages, sometimes pushes her into greater leadership roles. And that really is about leading the next generation. Verse 10 of chapter 2. Esther had not made known her people or kindred. Okay, she's Jewish. She's in this hostile environment, and she's in this process of being chosen as queen. And listen, I know this has been romanticized by movies and books and sermons, but this was a horrible situation. This evil, wicked, lust-filled king has fired the queen, and now he's on a nationwide search to build a harem. Okay, we would call this today sex trafficking. We would call this abusive today, but somehow it gets romanticized when we look back at this. And so Esther, because she's beautiful, is pulled into this not really beauty contest, but the guy's picking his queens, and it's a pretty vile thing going on. And yet she doesn't reveal that she's Jewish, and she ends up being the one chosen to be the replacement queen, but yet there's still a harem, and she's one of hundreds, maybe thousands of women that this king is controlling. And it says, so verse 10, she has not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. And it seems like he's concerned. This is not like this celebration, yay, you were picked, and this is a love story. It's not that at all. And he's concerned. He's watching out for her the best he can, and he's coaching her how to survive in this environment by, hey, just don't let them know you're really Jewish. And then we flip over to verse 20, and it repeats the same thing. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. And so a couple of thoughts we'll get back to is twice he's commanding her. Yet that language is pretty strong in a leadership context, and she's obeying, she's following. There's a love and a respect, and she's compliant with what Mordecai is saying, and it's for her own good. But what we find is he's looking out for the next generation. He's providing leadership, he's providing, helping create platforms, and even, as we'll see in a moment, point number 2, he's bringing correction. And so if you want to think like a leader here, looking at Mordecai, number 1, it's multi-generational. setting up the next generation for success. Secondly, it's correcting the next generation. And what we find is Mordecai challenges Esther's fears and her self-preservation. And he really pushes in a way further than she would have gone. And so what's happened is Esther's queen, and yet there's this plot to kill the Jews. Don't have time to go through the story of why, but the king has created a law where one day of the year you can now, all of these Persians can go and find and hunt down Jewish families, kill them all, slaughter them, and then take all of their belongings. And so this is the law. And now Mordecai finds out, and he is challenging Esther to go and do what she can as the favored of the king and see what she can do to fix this. And so look at what he does in verse 12. He's put this before her and asking her to step up and take a risk and save her people. At least try. And the rule is if anyone goes to the king's chambers without being invited, they're killed automatically. She hasn't been invited in 30 days, it says. She hasn't seen the king. There's all these other harem that he has, that he controls, and he's kind of forgotten it, Esther, at this point. And she's afraid for her life to do what Mordecai is saying to do, and she sends a message back, she's not going to do it. It's verse 12 of chapter 4. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, which is basically, no, I'm not going to do this. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Now, twice we've been told she didn't tell them that she was Jewish, but Mordecai is saying they'll find out. And all the Jews are about to be killed, and you need to step up. Verse 14, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So point is this, he's correcting her fear. He's challenging her to go further than she wants to go. He's leading her to risk her life for this moment. So he's setting up the next generation for success. Number two, in thinking like Mordecai as a leader, he's challenging the next generation. He's correcting the next generation. It's not all just encouragement. There's going deeper than that, as we see from Mordecai. Number three, and this is interesting at the end of this passage we just read where he's challenging her, this verse 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And so she's saying, okay, I'll do it. She's going to follow Mordecai's command, his encouragement, his challenge. And then in verse 17, Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. We've seen in the previous chapters that Esther's doing what Mordecai commands. Now we see Mordecai doing everything Esther ordered him to do. So if you want to think like a leader, number one, think multi-generationally. Set up the next generation for success. Number two, don't be afraid to challenge, to correct, and to lead the next generation into things that are risky and dangerous and not comfortable at all. But number three, be willing to submit to the next generation when God raises them up to the platform of leadership. And a lot of people are willing to help the next generation. They're willing to mentor and correct, but they're not willing to submit to them. They're not willing to really serve them and let them really lead. But real leadership means we will follow. And what Mordecai did here is it says he went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. And that is the turning here of one generation being willing to follow the next. So if we want to think like a leader, this is how we think. And then finally, the last point. And the last point comes out of the whole book of Esther. And here it is. Just because God is unmentioned does not mean God is uninvolved. Esther, as you know, as leaders, you know, is the only book in the Bible where God is not mentioned. There's no mention ever anywhere of God, but just because he's not mentioned doesn't mean he's not in control. It doesn't mean he's not present. It doesn't mean that he's uninvolved. Unmentioned does not mean uninvolved. We see God's hand all throughout the narrative, and we need to learn as leaders to see God when he's not so obvious, to see the hand of God when it takes some real faith to step up and see God. It's easy to dismiss, and why has God abandoned me, and why is he not moving here or there, and why is he not doing what we think he should? But so often he is, and we're missing it because it takes some focus and some real attention, and it takes a step of faith. So just because he's not mentioned doesn't mean he's not involved. We see right from the beginning how of all the women in the nation, how Esther ends up getting that place as the queen. That was the hand of God. Then we see in the next chapter how Mordecai accidentally or providentially overhears a plot, reports it, and those people, the king is saved and those people are killed, and is written in the history book. Years later, we find the king can't sleep. He asks someone to read him some of the history. They happen to pick the right book. They happen to open to the right page. And guess what? It's the story of Mordecai. And so then the king exalts Mordecai. And so we see over and over, chapter after chapter, we see the providential hand of God all over this story, but no mention of God. So if you want to think like a leader, think next generation. You want to think like a leader? Be willing to challenge the next generation to go beyond their comfort zone. You want to think like a leader? Be willing to follow and serve and submit to next generation leaders. And finally, if you want to think like a leader, think providentially. See the hand of God, even if there's not a billboard announcing it.